Imagine holding a switchboard through Imagine holding a switchboard through which millions of people control what every company may do with their data. Every log you keep may decide a dispute. Every shareholding you hold may compromise your neutrality. Every rupee of your revenue model is a question about whose side you're on. That is the daily condition of a registered consent manager. And part B of the first schedule is the rulebook for living it. Yesterday was getting through the gate. Today is every day after. The obligations that never sleep, the disclosures that go down to 2%, the logs that outlive most marriages. And, for everyone else listening, the duties that land on ordinary companies the moment this ecosystem switches on. You're listening to DPDP Daily. I'm Hamid Singh Kapoor. I've spent my career running large programs and portfolios, the discipline of making complex things actually happen. And for the past few years, I've brought that discipline to India's data protection law. I wrote the DPDP Act Compliance Handbook from law to ground reality, and this show is that book, opened up one episode at a time. If you're new here, the 30-second background: in 2023, India passed its first comprehensive data protection law, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. In November 2025, the government notified the rules that make it operational on a phase clock that runs to full enforcement in May 2027. Together, they decide what every company, hospital, school, app, and shopkeeper in this country may do with your personal data and what you can demand when they get it wrong. 15 minutes a day, no jargon, real answers. Let's get into it. Begin with the obligation that governs all others, because Part B is really one principle with machinery attached. The consent manager must act in a fiduciary capacity toward the data principle. We spent an episode on why India chose the word fiduciary for ordinary companies. Here, the word runs hotter still. The consent manager exists for the citizen, is accountable to the citizen, and every structural rule that follows is Parliament ensuring the switchboard operator never quietly starts working for the companies on the other end of the wires. The independence architecture first, because it's where that principle bites hardest. The consent manager must avoid conflicts of interest with the data fiduciaries it interoperates with, and the schedule refuses to leave conflict to imagination. Disclosure obligations reach the promoters, directors, key managerial personnel, and senior management, and extend to shareholdings in data fiduciaries down to a 2% threshold in a body corporate. 2%. The drafters weren't guarding against the obvious, the consent platform openly owned by a conglomerate. They were guarding against the quiet 2.5% stakes through which influence actually travels in Indian corporate life. For operating consent managers, this is a living compliance system, not a form. A register of interests across your senior people, refreshed as their portfolios move, because a director's new fintech investment can create tomorrow the conflict that didn't exist at registration. Then the evidentiary spine. Every consent given, managed, reviewed, or withdrawn through the platform, logged and retained for at least 7 years. We've called this log the neutral witness since episode 1. Today, the operational reading. 7 years of tamper-evident, retrievable, per-principle records is an engineering commitment, storage, integrity, retrieval at dispute speed, and a governance one. The log must survive platform migrations, vendor changes, even the consent manager's own corporate turbulence. And notice who relies on it: the citizen proving she withdrew in March, the fiduciary proving consent existed in January, the board deciding between them. Infrastructure whose entire value is credibility must be run like it, which is exactly why the audit loop exists. Effective mechanisms to monitor its own technical measures, continued satisfaction of the registration conditions, and adherence to obligations reported to the board periodically and on demand. A consent manager is, permanently, mid-inspection. Then the continuity logs. Control of the company cannot transfer. No sale, no merger, no change of control without the board's previous approval. The license attaches to the examined entity, not to whoever buys it, closing the build and flip route and forcing investor patience into the sector's DNA. And the enforcement ladder above it all, the board may direct corrective measures and may suspend or cancel registration after hearing, reasons in writing, with the data principal's interests protected through the process, because a switchboard cannot simply go dark on the millions routed through it. If you heard the board procedure disciplines of episode 11 in that sentence, natural justice, written reasons, you're hearing the framework's consistency, and it's deliberate. Now, the part of today addressed to everyone who will never apply for this license, the fiduciary's side of the ecosystem. When registered consent managers go live, ordinary companies inherit duties by reflection. The Act, as we saw in the consent episodes, contemplates consent given, managed, and withdrawn through a consent manager, which means your systems must honor signals arriving from that channel with the same force as signals arriving in your own app. A withdrawal transmitted by a consent manager is a withdrawal, full stop, with the entire cascade of episode 17 behind it. Stop processing, propagate to processors, start the erasure analysis. Integration, whenever the technical standards make it concrete, will therefore run in both directions. Consent artifacts in, status changes out, and the architecture decision I've urged since the consent episode stands. Build the seam now, an interface point in your consent lifecycle system where the external channel plugs in so that standards publication triggers configuration, not reconstruction. And one more fiduciary side truth worth internalizing early. The consent manager's log will evidence disputes about you. Your own consent records and the platforms must agree. Reconciliation between the two becomes a compliance activity nobody has staffed yet and everybody will need. Step back and read Part B's design as a whole, because the pattern teaches something about where this framework is heading. Fiduciary duty as the principle, independence enforced structurally rather than rhetorically, evidence mandated at courtroom grade, supervision continuous rather than episodic, exit controlled. That is not how India regulates apps. It's how India regulates market infrastructure, depositories, exchanges, aggregators. Parliament looked at the consent layer and decided it belongs in that company. Whether the economics reward anyone for operating under such discipline remains the open question this show has carried since episode 1. The who pays problem the first cohort must solve under the board's watchful reading of every revenue line. The answer, when the market finds it, will be one of the more interesting business model stories in Indian tech, and we'll cover it as it unfolds. Tomorrow, the arc moves from the consent layer to the vault. Rule 6, where reasonable security safeguards finally gets names. Encryption, access control, logs, backups, the one-year monitoring trail, and where we map the named floor onto a security program a real organization can run and evidence. That's today's episode of DPDP Daily. If it made this law a little clearer, do one thing for me. Send it to one person who needs it. That's how this show grows. Everything I covered today, with the templates, checklists, and audit frameworks behind it, is in my book, The DPDP Act Compliance Handbook, From Law to Ground Reality. And I post one practical DPDP insight every morning. Find me on LinkedIn and on X and Facebook as well, under Harmeet S. Kapoor. One important note, this is education, not legal advice. For decisions about your organization or your rights, take proper professional advice on your specific facts. New episode every day. I'll see you tomorrow.